ahead and get started. All right, thank you guys all so much for being here. I'm Gretchen Purser. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and also the co-director of the Labor Studies Working Group. So anyway, I'm Gretchen Purser, professor in the Department of Sociology and the co-director of the Labor Studies Working Group. And I am super excited to see you all here today for this talk by Shannon Gleeson. And let me just start by saying Shannon and I were graduate students together at UC Berkeley in the Department of Sociology. So it's really always a pleasure to have some of your former colleagues come to your new institution and share their brilliant work with students and colleagues alike. Shannon Gleeson is an associate professor of labor relations, law, and history in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, just down the road. Her research focuses on workplace rights, the experiences of immigrant workers, and the role of advocacy organizations in holding government bureaucracies accountable. She's the author of Conflicting Commitments, The Politics of Enforcing Immigrant Worker Rights in San Jose and Houston, and the author of Precarious Claims, The Promise and Failure of Workplace Protections in the United States. I'm teaching a course right now, a seminar for graduate students on work and labor, and Shannon Gleeson just came to my class and presented to my graduate students, and we had a riveting discussion about that book, Precarious Claims. But we're really excited to have her here today to speak about a newer and a broader project called Standing with Immigrant Workers, Labor Strategies of Resistance in the Age of Trump. So I want to do two more things. First, I want to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. And I also want to acknowledge the generous funding that we received from PARC for the Labor Studies Working Group, as well as from the Work, Labor, and Citizenship 10th Decade Project of the Maxwell School. We're going to actually begin, perhaps in a non-traditional fashion, by having community advocates come up and give a little talk, little tiny announcement about some of the campaigns that they're working on. And after they've done so, rather than have them do that at the end, after they've done so, then we're going to turn it over to Shannon Gleeson for her talk today. So, Crispin, Joel, ¿quién más? ¿Quién más viene? Okay.
Sí, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Crispin. Yo trabajo con Centro de Trabajadores y estamos aquí para pedir su ayuda, que nos apoyen en lo que es la campaña de la licencia.
Good afternoon. My name is Crispin Hernandez. I'm a Worker Center organizer, and we're here to ask for your support for our driver's license campaign.
Sí, estamos trabajando a nivel estatal y lo que ahorita tenemos a 68 asambleístas y 25 senadores que están apoyando la campaña, pero queremos más ayuda de todo para que sea una ley para que todos los inmigrantes puedan obtener una licencia en este estado de Nueva York.
So this is a legislative campaign where we have the support of 68 assembly members, 25 senators, which is really good, but we want more support because we really want this to be access for driver's license for everybody.
Aquí le dejo la palabra aquí mi compañero que explique qué tan importante es una licencia. Gracias.
So I'll let my compañero talk about how important is a driver's license for us.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Joel, soy miembro del Centro de Trabajadores y un trabajador agrícola.
Hello everybody, my name is Joel. I'm a Worker Center member and I'm a farm worker.
Quiero decir la importancia de tener una licencia. Es muy importante para nosotros los que trabajamos en la agricultura. Es indispensable para ir al trabajo, para ir de compras, para ir a llevar a los niños a la escuela y hasta para ir a la iglesia necesitamos obtener una licencia.
For us, it's really important to have a driver's license, especially for those who work in agriculture. We needed to get to and from work, but we also needed to go and do our grocery shoppings, to go to the hospital, to take our kids to school, and even to go to church.
En las áreas rurales hay personas que son raiteros, pero la verdad es que en ocasiones cobran mucho y una licencia nos hará más independientes.
In rural areas, we have what we call raiteros, which is people that charge people money for rides. But the truth is that they charge very large amounts of money, so having a driver's license for us will make us more independent.
La verdad es que muchos trabajadores emigrantes sin documento legal, la misma necesidad los ha empujado a adquirir un automóvil y manejarlo sin licencia, pero eso trae graves consecuencias.
The truth is that a lot of undocumented workers' need has pushed them to get a car, even without a driver's license, and then they get it, they drive it, but that really causes a lot of problems.
Cuando ellos cometen una infracción muchas veces por error o por no saber las leyes, las reglas de tránsito, y son parados por la policía, lo que pasa ahí es que cuando el policía los interroga y se da cuenta que no tienen una licencia de conducir y que son indocumentados, se los pasa a migración y realmente eso se convierte en una deportación y una separación familiar.
So if somebody is driving and they are stopped by the police, even though because they committed a traffic infraction and because they don't really understand the laws on the road, what would happen is that a police will stop them, and if they don't have a driver's license, the police force would call immigration to come and get them, and then that triggers this whole deportation proceedings, and people get arrested, and that is how family separation looks here.
Siempre pensamos que la separación familiar daña mucho a los niños. Bueno, cuando yo era niño, siempre me preocupó cuando había problemas en la casa, si papá y mamá se separaban y que nosotros queríamos a los dos. Entonces, ¿qué iba a ser de nosotros, que éramos 9 de familia? En esta situación de la separación familiar por emigración, causa mucho daño a las familias, a los hijos y a las hijas.
So family separation really affects kids a lot. I know that when I was a kid, I was really worried about my family separating. So, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing. So having family separation here, it really affects the kids a lot.
Algunos niños, desde niños tienen ya sueños, ya metas, propuestas de lograr, y esta separación los afecta porque a dónde quedan sus sueños. Esta acción de migración mata totalmente sus sueños y los puede orillar a tomar decisiones equivocadas.
So a lot of kids have already their dreams and their goals, but when the family separation happens, those dreams or goals are they're no longer possible, and what could end up happening is those kids end up making the wrong decisions in their lives.
Bueno, es todo, y les pedimos que apoyen a la campaña de las licencias. Gracias.
Thank you. That's it. That's everything, and please support the driver's license.
All right, thanks everyone. It's a real honor to follow up individuals who are doing the work out in the community up here in Syracuse, and I thank you for giving them that space. All right, so I'm just going to get started and to orient you a little bit about what I'm here to talk about today. I think it's great to start off with a few labor organizers themselves talking a bit about the work that they're doing. But I'm going to pivot a bit, and I'm going to talk about the role of immigration writ large in the labor movement, and talk to you about a project that I initiated trying to understand how the process of supporting immigrant workers has played out in the U.S. labor movement over the last few years under the current administration. I want to start by laying the groundwork, and this is information that most of you are probably quite familiar with, about what immigration law looked like before the current presidential administration. Even prior to the current president, we had a very complicated system with long delays. It's what many often refer to as a broken immigration system, and I say broken because I often say that it actually works perfectly fine for certain folks who are benefiting from it. And we know that we've had a series of failed comprehensive immigration reform efforts, embattled short-term policies like DACA, and after that DAPA, and an increase in deportations. These are all policy shifts that were happening long before 2016, 2017. So what has changed? And I want us to set this context before talking about the role that the labor movement has played in resistance to these policies. It's easy to kind of think about the specific policies that the current administration has put in place, and we could go on about what those look like, but just a few highlights include things like putting in place a hotline highlighting the criminal activity of immigrants, a border buildup, which we've seen on a daily basis, also a ramp up in terms of the resources afforded to the Interior Immigration Enforcement, a change that we here in upstate New York feel very acutely. We've heard a lot about the travel ban targeting primarily Muslim immigrants, free trade policies that are being revamped with a focus on what I refer to as an economic nationalism, and a devastating attack on the asylum process. Other changes which you may have noticed include just the general ramp up in enforcement efforts, increased focus on the work site as a target of immigration enforcement, and a range of other things, which I think amounts to really an acceleration of the current trends that we saw in place. So taken together, I think that what we see under the current administration is what we have long understood to be a devolution of immigration control from the federal regime to both local actors and in some cases international and transnational actors, but really centering the workplace and employers as a major aspect of the immigration enforcement apparatus. And so I want to take a moment and to think about where do workers fit into the federal policy regime. On the one hand, given all the policies that I just talked about, immigrants, in particular undocumented immigrants, although not all, even including others with liminal status, are subject to what we refer to as employer sanctions. They are a surveillance target. They are the main focus of agencies such as Customs and Border Protection. They are the focus of many efforts such as E-Verify, no-match letters, et cetera, et cetera. They are what we would essentially refer to as deportable aliens, to use the language of the US government. But on the other hand, they are protected workers. A range of administrative agencies see undocumented workers in particular not only as a vital part of the labor force, but also a target of outreach in their efforts to keep employers compliant to laws that affect all workers, including the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Equal Opportunity Commission, and also the wage and hour provisions. So there's this contradictory space that undocumented workers inhabit. But what's happened in the current regime is we've seen, as I've mentioned, a shift to the work site as what it's long been, but even more so now, a primary target of enforcement. And so just to kind of remind you where we've been in the last couple of years, the last ICE director did a ramp up in terms of the personnel and the resources targeting worksite enforcement. We saw the resurgence of what we used to refer to as these large-scale spectacles of raids, which used to be popularized under the Bush administration and have since went down under the Obama administration, but have been resurrected as a primary enforcement apparatus. So about a quadrupling of more workplace crackdowns. We also see that workers themselves are feeling the chilling effect of this changing immigration policies. So more workers are saying that their bosses are threatening to have them deported. We see that by talking to low-wage worker advocates like lawyers who talk about the role that immigration-related retaliation is playing in their ability to do worker advocacy. Places that we previously designated as safe spaces, including places like courthouses and labor commissioner offices, are no longer off limits. We have seen attempts by the federal government to move into these spaces without even notifying the existing state or local administrators of their presence to try to apprehend unknowing subjects. And I think that we see an effort on the part of the national DOL to continue to hold accountable in some pro forma way, the employers that their mission tells them that they should be making sure are in compliance. And so Alex Acosta, as I mentioned in our seminar earlier, who's the current Secretary of Labor, has kept in place a memorandum of understanding that supposedly keep a firewall between the workplace enforcement efforts of the DOL and the workplace enforcement efforts of ICE. But many of us, I think, agree that those MOUs are, for the large part, ineffective. And lastly, as any labor organizer knows, ICE has long used what we refer to as ruse operations, going under the cover of being a worker advocate to entrap workers on site. And we've seen this going all the way back to Michael Chertoff in the wake of 9/11, but using, for example, OSHA training operations as a way to round up workers for deportation. So all of these are characteristics of the current immigration enforcement regime. And we also know that immigration activists are increasingly a target of this deportation machine. In Vermont, we heard over the last few years of targeting of some of the leaders there who were focused on rallying for the rights of the dairy workers in Vermont. We also know that many of the young people organizing on campuses such as yours, have also been targeted. So this is the context in which we are in, a continuation of many of the policies that have been long in place and an intensification of the resources to carry them out. So I go through that because I want us to know what is the context into which the labor movement, and specifically traditional labor unions, are stepping as they respond to this policy environment. So let's take a moment to orient ourselves to these organizations. You guys are all a labor crowd, so I don't need to give you the rundown of what a traditional labor union are. But we know that the labor movement has had a long history of somewhat contradictory relationships to their foreign-born workers, what we might refer to as a long history of institutionalized xenophobia. And this was reversed actually only fairly recently in 2001 with the National Declaration of Inclusion at one of the national convenings. This is happening alongside the reality that 1 in 5 foreign-born workers are foreign-born, and an estimated 5% of the undocumented workforce, of the civilian workforce, are undocumented. And so unions in this demographic reality play a key role in the immigrant rights movement. But what I want to talk about today is what are the various strategies and goals that they've been adopting. And also, amidst those vocal responses, what are some of the strategic silences that we also see in response to Trump-era policies? So just to summarize where I'm headed, what I'm interested in doing in this project is to look inward at the U.S. labor movement. And I say inward because I've come out of a labor school that's kind of taken as a given the role of the traditional labor movement. And to ask how have U.S. labor unions varied in their approach to championing or limiting immigrant rights. We often think of the labor movement as a monolith, and so what I want to talk about today a bit is how they have varied both in terms of across the trades, but also in terms of across their various strategies. I want to focus a bit on the narrative frames that each of these labor constituencies have used to advance and justify their inclusion of immigrants. And what I'm going to argue is that many of those frames end up being in some ways counterproductive to the broader goals of the immigrant rights movement. And to ask a series of critical questions about the role of the labor movement's immigration platform in engaging an explicitly intersectional lens that the immigrant rights movement has increasingly demanded, and which declares solidarity with Black, Muslim, and LGBT workers. So I'm headed in that direction, and I want to start by first talking about what the labor movement has meant for the vanguard of immigrant rights policies in the United States. And before actually doing that, let me tell you a little bit about how I gathered my data. I'm happy to kind of talk about this more later, but this is really a content analysis of the public documents generated by the labor movement. So we rely largely on a social media recap and looking at the websites of traditional labor unions, and I'll talk about which ones in a second. Press releases, news coverage, looking in the top 10 states by foreign-born population in the top 3 metros within that, and also a series of interviews with a range of labor organizations, including the AFL-CIO and the building trades, as well as a series of what we might refer to as immigrant unions, as well as the AFT, the teachers who have played a big role in student advocacy. So where have unions been traditionally over the last decade at the vanguard of immigrant rights. And I want to be very clear that unions have played an important role not only in terms of lip service, but also in terms of actually generating some of the policies that have been adopted in pro-worker, pro-immigrant contexts. So David Bacon, a photojournalist that many of you may know, wrote about this last year, thinking about the new legislation that California has been putting in place to protect undocumented workers from employer retaliation, limiting the amount of cooperation that employers can have with ICE on their property, and thinking through the role that the state needs to play in protecting their undocumented workforce. All of those initiatives we can thank the labor movement for. Many of those began initially as initiatives within labor unions like the UFCW, SEIU. Here we have an example of a rally of San Francisco janitors and other workers in support of AB 450, which was a bill to protect workers during immigration raids and enforcement actions, and one which the federal government is currently litigating. The labor movement has also played a key role in terms of generating right-to-work resources and trying to initiate an institutional culture change among the rank and file to talk about the role that not only xenophobia, but also racism, sexism, and a range of other things play in dividing the house of labor. So Know Your Rights workshops have been generated amongst local affiliates and adopted by the AFL-CIO. We can have a bigger conversation about what the leadership at the AFL-CIO has looked like, but it suffices it to say that the top brass of the AFL-CIO has, at least on the face of it, shifted and pivoted towards a more inclusive approach to immigrant workers. We also know that locals, central labor councils, are playing an important role in educating employers themselves about what their rights are if ICE ends up on their property, and also educating workers about their rights beyond the workplace if they are stopped by the police in many of the scenarios that we just heard about from our compañeros, and also what if ICE shows up at your door. So what we see is a shift from unions not only thinking about the needs of immigrant and undocumented workers, but also what does an immigrant-friendly and an immigrant-inclusive union look like beyond simply focusing on the 9 to 5 of the work site. Collective bargaining agreements have also been a critical model for inclusive language. Many of the collective bargaining agreements adopted by unions such as Unite Here have included specific provisions preventing re-verification on the part of management under programs such as E-Verify. And so much of the pushback that we see has really come out of the rank and file in these unions. So suffice it to say, unions have played an incredibly important role in generating many of these policies that we then see adopted by more progressive governments. So what I want to do now is think about the whys. Why do we see this pivot towards an inclusive approach to immigrants? And in some ways, sitting right now where we are in 2019, that might seem like a silly question to ask. We've come to equate the immigrant rights movement with the labor movement, but in fact, if you are a labor historian, you know that that was not always the case. So I want to talk a bit about what are the rationales that we see for inclusion within the labor movement, and what are the narratives that the labor organizations that I looked at use to advance their pro-immigrant agenda. And I want to take a moment here and say a little bit about why we might care about the narratives that organizations and institutions use. We know a lot from the social movement literature that frames are an important tool in determining the state of play of many of the debates, but they're also in response to competition not only between social movements but also counter movements. So the context that I just laid out for you illustrates that in many ways the union and the labor movement, but also the immigrant rights movement more generally, are on the defensive and are adopting frames directly in response to xenophobic and racist narratives being generated both within and without the labor movement. So these frames are an important reflection of those contests between social movements and counter movements. But I also think that institutions become an important part of this process. So to be sure, the labor movement is one of the key social movements that we would focus on to understand this, but unions themselves and the bureaucracies that they're attached to also become important for the ways in which they either adopt and or reify these frames in everyday life. And even though sociologists have done a lot of work thinking about what we refer to kind of as the immigrant threat narrative, what are the narratives being generated in opposition to immigrants, we haven't really paid as much attention to what are the narratives of rights and inclusion and how those rights narratives become salient and institutionalized. Some of the existing work out of political science and political sociology has pointed to a particular set of narratives that become salient for the general public, for being able to stomach the new demographic changes that they're seeing, and this idea of American values as being a salient frame for immigrant rights, we know is important. And what I'm going to show is actually reflective in many of the ways in which unions are talking about workers, immigrant workers, as a important part of their constituency, but one which plays a very particular role in advancing their own pro-worker aims. So I'm going to talk about 4 specific frames for immigrant rights that emerged in the data that we reviewed. And I'm going to not talk about these necessarily as exclusive, mutually exclusive. In fact, you're going to see a lot of overlap, but think of them as different entry points into framing the rights of immigrants. And then I'm going to pivot afterwards to consider what some of the limitations of these narratives might be. And think of them as actual calculated responses with clear costs and benefits attached to them. So I want to start by thinking about the argument and the debate ongoing about immigrants as threat versus fellow Americans. One of the things that we did is look at op-eds and different public statements that labor leaders generated. And this is a quote from one of the leaders out of Orange County who talked about America's Latino immigrant community is helping to revitalize the nation's shrinking middle class. El Super, this was one of the ethnic markets that was under an organizing drive in Southern California, is aggressively attempting to lower the bar. Southern California's standards of pay and benefits for retail grocery workers has for many years set the standard for workers in urban centers across the country. El Super, however, has clearly told its employees to tone down their American dreams. So equating immigrant workers with, just like you and I, individuals pursuing the immigrant dream, I think is a strong part of one of the rationales. Thinking about the hopes and aspirations that immigrants have as looking very similar to yours and mine, I think is an important shift. Aside from kind of rejecting this othering of the hopes and aspirations of immigrants, we also see a real focus, perhaps not surprisingly, on immigrant workers as economic producers, right? The argument that immigrants are conducting the work that Americans won't do, that they are essential to economic growth. For example, here's a series of samplings from various central labor councils. LA County talking about how immigrants keep our nation afloat. The Virginia State Fed also referring to immigrants in the sense that there's just no compelling proof that immigration, quote, squeezes out native-born workers in any systemic way. Also thinking about the systemic cost of deportation out of Florida. DACA deportations would cost billions for states like California, Texas, and Illinois, and ultimately put 700,000 jobs at risk. And finally, from the vice president of the AFL-CIO itself, thinking about immigrant workers and the economic force that bring the power of their labor to this country. So thinking about immigrant workers as economic producers and the reductionist ways in that, in some ways we might want to think about, leaves out other immigrants themselves. Lastly, as we heard actually previous to me starting, thinking about immigrants as family and upstanding citizens, individuals that we would want in our community. In Central Valley, the United Farm Workers talking about immigrants as feeding not just this district, but the entire country every day, including Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been saying that we're murderers and we're rapists. Again, this kind of pushing back in a defensive way to the characterizations of immigrants. In Texas, even SB 4, which some of you might remember was state legislation that not only at the same time was creating a show me your papers state-level policy that permitted police to ask for individuals' paperwork in a racial profiling context, referred to by the Texas AFL-CIO as a direct attack on Texan values and hardworking Texas families, right? And finally, SEIU 32BJ out of New York City, also thinking about the shift towards the dismantling of the temporary protected status program as something that would impact not only immigrant workers, but also the families that they have here and the homes that they also own, right? So immigrant workers as upstanding citizens, immigrant workers as economic producers, and immigrant workers as family members. And we see this played out also in terms of the iconography and many of the social media posts, thinking about immigrant workers as being central and vital to the very fabric of our nation. This is a rally out of LA on May Day back in 2016. That's Rusty Hicks, the county CLC leader. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the idea of immigrant workers as being central to advancing an agenda of diversity and racial justice. In other words, immigration-driven diversity is being beneficial to the United States. We often hear about immigrants as being central to our country's nation-building narrative, right? Connecting immigrant rights with racial justice. In other words, as one labor leader put it, race and immigration status have historically been used to divide the working class and weaken our power to protect the rights and freedoms that level the playing field for working families. Out of Boston, we see similar narratives in response to the Safe TPS campaign, the Boston Labor Council condemning the racist and ignorant remarks about Haitians, African Americans, and Latin Americans, as you may remember the shithole comment, and thinking about the importance of standing with immigrant union members and specifically their families out of a perspective of racial justice. Similarly, when we saw the first Muslim ban put in place, we see individuals who flocked to airports. This is the Dallas AFL-CIO, who brought a contingent of people to think about the importance of equating the immigrant rights fight for racial justice with also previous attempts to stave off anti-Semitic, if you can't read this, Jews against history repeating itself no more, right? So linking the Islamophobic attacks to the racial justice efforts locally as well. But amidst all of these wranglings, we also see that labor is not a uniform entity, right? Early on in the Trump presidency, we had a series of uncomfortable relationships brewing between top brass labor leadership and the president. So just to remind you of the early days of after the inauguration, early in January 7, 2017, Rich Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, met with Trump at Trump Tower. Later that month, he also went on to meet with other labor leaders in the Oval Office, talking about a pullout of the TPP, discussing the importance of promoting a pipeline. And later in April, we also see Trump showing up at one of the building trades national conferences. And even there, though, while you do see some pushback from local rank and file from, for example, the IBEW, #resist, you saw an overall kind of rejection of internal criticism from the rank and file towards the president. I think labor has also had to contend with the uncomfortable relationship with many of its own affiliates that have a direct hand in the immigration enforcement apparatus. We've seen a call for the AFL-CIO to expel the Border Patrol Union after they endorsed the, Donald Trump as presidency. And even a kind of push towards thinking about the labor movement's relationship with its police unions, which have for a long time protected the officers involved in police brutality and those involved in this direct pipeline to deportation, which we heard about at the outset. So although we see kind of a uniform push from the top in favor of immigrant rights, we also see several instances where the labor movement has had to ask itself what role it's playing in advancing the immigration enforcement apparatus. When I talked to labor leaders about this kind of contradiction, they made it clear that getting the national leadership and even the state and local leadership on board is a different matter than actually creating institutional change amongst the rank and file. He talked to me, for example, this is out of Massachusetts, the North Shore Central Labor Council, talked about what it was like convincing their workers that immigrants from Latino backgrounds were their brothers and sisters in the House of Labor versus, for example, the Muslim ban. He said, the Muslim ban is a little bit different. I've seen an uptick in outreach to mosques, but a core part of the more conservative part of our members is this link to terrorism. It's always a little difficult, sometimes to explore what motivates the more extreme right-wing folks. Is it white supremacy? Is it misogyny? Is it fear of terrorists, loss of privilege? Who knows? Is it economic insecurity, which is definitely an element of it, or what? But clearly a part of this kind of nonsense. So he went on to talk about how, you know, he had been a key part of the statewide and also national push of his union to be more inclusive even around issues of Islamophobia, but that there was a clear distinction between the work he was doing, looking upwards, and then the rank and file institutional culture change that was going to take more effort. And I want to point us to the words of Chamtale Hook, who's really pointed to the challenges of this call to rally the working class to resist Trump's registry, in this case of Muslims. And she talks about the role that the election played with working class whites. She said, the election where many working class whites, some of them unionized, opted to vote according to narrow economic interests rather than for the safety and security of working communities, revealed that unions need to engage in a political education around these issues such as structural racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. The election revealed the repeated failure to have the discussion of these issues. On these issues, communities of color have been urging, and this is why we now face a Trump presidency. In order for us to move forward, we need to explore ways to provide support and protection for working class communities of color, engage unions in these discussions, and shift our organizing strategy to employ an intersectional analysis that snaps to focus the place of South Asian and Muslim workers as a part of the labor community. And that refocusing is one of the sticking points that emerged in many of the interviews in particular that I conducted. And I think this became really apparent when I talked to one leader in Washington State who talked about needing to align the work around immigrant rights with some of the racial justice movement they were doing. And she recounted kind of a pivot that her organization had to do in this regard. She said, well, we had supported Black Lives Matter and gone to rallies, things like that, and then the initiative, UFCW 21, worked with us to do this initiative. She's talking about one in support of racial justice. And so we reached out to the leaders in the black community, and I guess, just to be honest, they kind of said, okay, we recognize that you want to help, but how about taking a look first at what's happening in labor? You might want to help yourselves first, which was very true. I said, yeah, that's true. It's just arrogant of us to think that we're going to rush in and help when we've got our own practices that are perpetuating racism, and we need to look at that and address it. And she went on to talk about how this was very much tied to their approach to immigrant rights as well. She also discussed that one of the ironic kind of twists under the current administration is that in the upsurge of anti-immigrant policies, she has also seen a need, as she recounted, that all these things which require us to be more nimble because you don't know where the next attack is coming from or from where it's going to be directly, and also, she argued, more militant. So on the one hand, you see a lot of shifting in terms of the ways in which immigrants are talking about immigrants, but she also talked about clearly a need to be more militant in addressing this. In other words, what are the risks that unions themselves are willing to undertake in addition to the very important work that they're doing at the policy level in terms of know your rights training and the rest. And in fact, she argued that it was the Trump administration's more punitive shift that in some ways had sparked what she argued might be a more productive shift long term. I want to kind of end by thinking about what a potential more radical flank might look like, both within the labor movement, but also in solidarity with worker advocacy groups and immigrant advocacy groups with whom they are building coalitions. And I want to start by kind of identifying where we see moments of that already occurring amongst rank and file and in local leadership where we wouldn't necessarily assume it's present. So 3 kind of instances, one of which I've already mentioned already, but at the National Building Trades Conference in April of 2017, where Trump came to talk, you saw this kind of organized response on the part of IBEW workers from the Imperial Valley, Riverside in Southern California, who launched this #resist campaign and were soon thereafter escorted out of the conference. But that has kind of persisted, and IBEW has become an important voice within the building trades. And the building trades as a whole are what one of their leaders on condition of anonymity explained to me would be at best a neutral force in the immigration debate, but one which more likely would run counter to the rights of immigrants. So you do see distinctions within the trades in opposition to the pro-wall, pro-Border Patrol Union narratives that we get as a whole. Another example is in the wake of some of the violent attacks on immigrants. You might remember in Portland, for example, there was an attack on 2 young women one of whom presented as a Muslim. And we had 2 bystanders, Good Samaritans, who were killed. It was actually the local labor union, with the pressure of local activists, who issued a statement in solidarity with what they called out, you can't read there, the brutal white supremacist assault that occurred on public transit. So taking a more proactive and a vocal stance towards racial justice and connecting that directly with immigrant rights. And we also see that this is tied in some ways to the changing face of immigrant leadership. In Minneapolis, the first female leader of the CLC there, Chelsea Gabu, made an explicit effort on first days of her administration to root her presidency of the head of that local labor council as one that would advance immigrant workers, and pointing specifically to the large Somali population in that CLC, right? And she also got quite a bit of pushback on that. But I think beyond these statements of solidarity and statements of proactive calling out of xenophobia and white supremacy, you also see a pushback, perhaps not within the labor movements, but certainly from immigrant rights members outside of it, of of pushing back against the narratives of immigrants as solely economic producers. You might have remembered the Hamilton meme that came out afterwards, thinking about immigrants as getting the job done and kind of reifying immigrants as this face of good capitalist productive labor. And you have groups like the Dreamers Adrift, which some of you may or may not know. They're an artistic group who have really pushed back even against this narrative that dreamers have to be this all-inclusive, perfect face of the immigrant rights movement. So thinking about immigrants as being more than their economic function, and actually thinking about their full humanity. And I think that this is a shift that we see coming from outside the immigrant rights, outside the labor movement, but also more likely at the fringes of the undocumented student movement as well. Another shift I think you see happening in the immigrant rights movement, which the labor movement has only really tangentially embraced, is centering trans women of color at the center of the immigrant rights movement. Geneset Gutierrez has played an important role of this, especially looking at the role of trans women in particular coming up from Central America who are at direct, line of detention and deportation at the border, and who are in literal fear of their lives. We have the example of, for example, Roxana Hernandez, who died in detention from HIV-related complications and was not granted the health care that she needed. So centering this as an issue of immigrant rights and centering the face of trans women of color is something that some of the local organizations within the labor movement have been proactive about embracing in large urban centers, in part through the Pride at Work initiative, but really not in any meaningful way to date. We've also seen within the immigrant rights movement an emerging radical flank around what does it mean to have sanctuary, right? Sanctuary being a set of policies that I think are often focused at the municipal and county level, but also a push from thinking about sanctuary as not only one that ties the rights of immigrants to live in their local communities without the explicit cooperation of local law enforcement, but also what does it mean to have sanctuary from not only deportation, but also displacement and police violence, right? So thinking about these broader conceptions of what sanctuary means. Also borrowing from tactics not only of social movements, but also the labor movement. What does it mean to apply a strike ethos to an immigrant rights movement? We've seen solidarities emerge between the prison labor movement and the detainees who've been on hunger strike at places like Adelanto on the border, and thinking about solidarity with prisoners, and also how to do that without reifying certain boundaries of criminality, right? How to talk about immigrants as being unjustly incarcerated without arguing that other communities are the true face of criminality. And lastly, I think we see examples of this here in your community as well, but also the creation of community resistance zones, right? The role of rapid response networks and efforts to mobilize not only immigrants, but also their allies, some of which include the labor movement, to be on site when immigration enforcement actions occur, right? And we see this is actually an example out of Philadelphia, which has had one of the more active resistance zones, but we also see examples of that here in upstate New York. Finally, I think that part of the conversation around what the immigrant rights movement will look like and the role that the labor movement will play has to do with what is it that we're asking for. And right now, I think a lot of these questions are emerging from the kind of congressional debates that are happening and the arguments that the president is putting forth about what he's going to need in exchange for the border wall, and a very small contingent of the immigrant rights community being very clear that it's all of us or none of us. And this is, I think, part of the policy debate that the labor movement has had a harder time with. The policies that the labor movement has been particularly enamored with include things like the guest worker policies for some aspects of the labor movement, more carved out temporary status provisions that might provide provisions for people to be here without deportation for a number of years, or even a parsed out solution for a subset of immigrants who may be parents of citizen children, right? And so we see examples from the student movement, right? This was an example you might remember from Nancy Pelosi's announcement of her willingness to negotiate with Donald Trump over DACA, and many of the students pushing back on the compromise that she and Chuck Schumer were willing to engage in exchange for staving off the border wall. And the labor movement has had to take these issues seriously because they've developed a very close relationship with many of the national student organizations like United We Dream, and the question becomes, what is the compromise that they are willing to endorse in exchange for a set of policies that make sense for their members? I think also there's a pushback on thinking about whose lives we argue matter, and so thinking about who is the face of the undocumented movement, again tying the undocumented student movement also to ones connected to racial justice, and thinking about immigrant students, immigrant youth, immigrant leaders as being ones willing to take risks in the face of a bigger policy debate. So one of the Undocumedia posts talked about is this generation of movement leaders who in many ways face a bleaker future with bigger obstacles who are radically redefining immigrant resistance in the age of Trump. In desperate times, an embattled immigrant rights movement can draw much hope and courage from the lucidity of their vision, the depth of their convictions, and their uncompromising resolve for all 11 million. And also thinking about the Undocu-Black experience as having a particular set of intersectionalities that need to be centered, not just pandered to as well. So to end here, because I think I'm right up on time, I wanted to talk about kind of where I'm headed with this research. Some of the work that I've been doing in conjunction with a colleague, Sophia Aptekar, has also been kind of tying what are some of the narratives of immigrant inclusion in the union movement to what we see amongst immigrant veterans and in the military. And we see some striking kind of points of overlap in terms of how both institutions, both the unions and the labor movement and the military, use immigrants as a way to advance particular mission readiness goals, thinking about the role of diversity, economic production, and also their relationship to the broader national leadership. I've also been working with a team of undergraduates to think through the differences within the labor movement, even within what we might refer to as immigrant unions, and the role that they have, the strategies that they have adopted differently, especially in different regions of the country, around certain policy issues that may, for example, be more salient for Haitians in Boston or in Florida versus some of the guest worker policies that have been bantied about that affect the largely farm worker communities in Central California. So I'm particularly interested in kind of continuing to parse out what does the face of the labor movement look like when you drill down deep into the specific affiliates and the communities that they represent, and also having an ongoing conversation about what the labor movement's role will be moving forward in immigrant rights agenda, and what are the points of friction that remain as they continue to try to coalesce a compromise not only with the national leadership but also with many of the allies in the broader immigrant rights community, which unions themselves also rely on in a very transactional way for their own campaigns. So I really look forward to your comments. This is, as I may have mentioned, work in progress, and I look forward to any thoughts that you might have about how to move this forward. So thank you.
This is a local story in a sense on unions. I was a janitor at under a contract, but not a union contract, at Lemoyne maybe 5 years ago, and a union came in and they got a union contract which bumped us into health benefits and a little bit of pay, not a small amount of pay, $1.50 an hour more, I think. But what did happen was that to pay for the health benefits, they cut the staff from 39 to 25 to stay in the budget. And then in forming the contract, they never formed a workers' council to work on the contract or accept the contract, which is kind of not anathema, but certainly not too cute to live through, in that your voices aren't being directly heard even by the union representatives on campus. So where am I going with this? I felt that the union people here, and it was SEIU, didn't spend enough time on campus to understand really the whole context of the site. And partly that was because they only had, by my calculation, about $12,000 a year that was coming out of union dues with such a small membership. So there was, problems with the union being, you might say, Mr. or Mrs. Perfect. Although they did orchestrate a benefit, they cut 14 jobs. I mean, they cut a third of the workforce essentially at the same time. And so they kind of played a destabilizing game in some ways.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, I will play off of one thing that you mentioned, which is who has a voice in union leadership. And I think that's been another kind of, to bring it back to some of the things that I was talking about, a key thing that I have found is that some of the lip service, to be crude, that we see being generated has to be backed up by institutional change, not only in terms of policies, but also who is the face of the union themselves. And so incorporating the changing demography of the rank and file in the actual leadership has been a very kind of contentious process for many locals, even in those where the vast majority of the rank and file are increasingly foreign born. And so I think the question is, when you see these decisions emerge about what they're going to endorse or what are the strategies they're going to adopt, who's at the table making those decisions? And so it's a great point. Yeah.
I'm coming. So thank you for coming and for a great talk. And I think, you point out the fact that this is really challenging for the unions, given their membership, their tradition. And I just wondered, what are sort of the voting patterns of union members, and how are those voting patterns playing into the complexity of, taking stance on immigrant workers if you have members who are worried about their jobs and to some degree have, drunk the Kool-Aid that immigrants are bad for, workers?
That's a good question. I'm not a political scientist, so I don't have these numbers at hand. But I will say that I think the two things that I've recalled looking at is one, that the partisan affiliation of the labor movement as a whole, we all know to be primarily allied with the Democratic Party, but what that means on the ground, even at the state level, differs quite a bit. So even in the state of New York, the interests of unions can't proceed on a strictly partisan basis down in Albany. We know that there are many alliances that have to be struck also with the GOP membership there. And so I think it differs state by state in terms of who are the partisan kind of deals that are being made and who are the politicians. But also it differs between, as I mentioned before, the leadership and the rank and file. And we got a bit of an insight into that with the representative from the North Shore Council. I think to be specific about the composition of some of the affiliates, in some cases you're dealing with a largely non-citizen population that doesn't vote. And so ultimately unions, in some ways, when we think back to kind of what were their incentives to incorporate immigrants to begin with, it's in some ways a challenging prospect. Rebecca Hamlin talks about this somewhat in some of the work that she did, kind of thinking about unions are inherently a political organization, right? They are, and this has been at the heart of a lot of the conversations around what the role of unions should be, but they play a good deal of their work, to spend a good deal of their time on organizing for certain policy proposals and the rest, and they rely on not only the rank and file to help sustain those political activities monetarily, but also through their voting patterns. And so what do you do when a good part of that membership, especially in certain affiliates like the low-skilled aspects of the trades, like the laborers or the carpenters, are non-citizen, right? And what does that mean both in terms of internal union democracy, in terms of who gets elected, but also in terms of the strategies that they adopt. One that focuses on kind of policy making may seem more salient for a citizen population versus not. That said, I think that many unions have been very proactive, even given their large non-citizen base. And you see the creation of affiliate groups like Mi Familia Vota, which is a get out the vote apparatus that SEIU has developed. And many of the boots on the ground are immigrant and in many cases non-citizen workers. So as political scientists have kind of thought about what does immigrant political participation look like, they've had to move away from voting as the only indicator of that, but also not assume that immigrants aren't very much involved in some of that. And so specific to their stance on immigrant workers, I haven't looked as much at the GSS polling data on this, but I just came back from another conference that talked about, there's a poll of Latinos out of California, and one of the interesting findings that Matt Barreto and colleagues at UCLA found is that some of the messaging coming out of the White House focusing on Mexicans as rapists, Mexicans as murderers, Mexicans as XYZ is actually having a pan-ethnic impact on Latinos as a whole, and that the coded language really is Latinos or Hispanics. And so there is even though the language that's being used is targeted to a particular country, it's the entire Latino population, including those who are citizens like Puerto Ricans, who are taking that as a direct affront. And so we might think about that, although we don't want to do it through rose-colored glasses, as an opportunity for solidarity.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mentioned at the end, the kind of spatial and regional variation that you've seen in terms of the way that unions are approaching inclusive organizing. And I know you already mentioned that kind of overlaps a lot with the trades or with the industry side of things as well. So,
sure. So yeah, I think that the spatial and regional variation is at least of three ways of looking at it. So just to reiterate, certainly you have places that are heavily dominated by the service industry, like in New York City, which has a hotel trades council, which has been very proactive. And so you have the apparatus in place to kind of focus on what are the immigration policies that are impacting, in that case, the hotel industry, right? And so in some places where you have large hotel chains who are being impacted by immigration policies like E-Verify and the rest. You see a concerted effort on the part of immigrant unions to not only lobby for policies that would help their members, but also create and invest hard cash resources in things that unions haven't typically done, like legal assistance or putting into collective bargaining contracts language around giving people time in the event of an audit to fix their paperwork. And so there, I think in immigrant-dense places and where you have the institutions like the Hotels Trade Councils and powerful unions like 32BJ, you see efforts to kind of become more of a service organization for their immigrants. In other places, I think it also depends on the composition of the immigrants. So New York City is a very diverse place, and so I didn't focus on that as much, but we see that in places like the Midwest, where you have large refugee populations, particularly on issues around Islamophobia, you have seen just a different kind of cut of what is important to the immigrant community there. And certainly you see this even in Buffalo, where the composition of the immigrant community is really more around the refugee population. And in fact, it was kind of striking to me when I first moved here, because our colleagues there were very quick to distinguish immigrants from refugees. And but there, a lot of it has to do with refugee resettlement and thinking about how the attack on refugee resettlement has impacted some of the economic investment initiatives coming out of Albany that have impacted not only the refugee community, but also the efforts to do economic revitalization writ large. And lastly, I would say leadership really matters, and leadership, but also the kind of civic ecology in which unions are located. So if we look at a place like New York City, or if we look at a place like San Francisco, the idea that unions have to demand a seat at the table is a battle that's already been fought, right? They have a seat at the table. It's a question of who else are they going to let sit at the table with them. Versus in places like Houston, where I've also done some work, the civic context is not as dense. It's much more anti-worker and anti-immigrant, and those non-labor organizations with whom unions are partnering become kind of a vital link to political power. And so where unions don't have a seat at the table, you see a different set of compromises and what I refer to as kind of more strategic allegiances emerging, right? In San Francisco, you can say, I'm not going to deal with the restaurant association. They're the devil. I'm not going to work with you, because you have the political power to do that, and you have a board of supervisors with whom you've built political capital. But in other places, you have to work with, in some cases, the chambers of commerce, or in this case, certain trade associations. And so the compromises that emerge from there are sometimes messier, and ones that don't necessarily advance what we would think at the national level as a uniformly immigrant-friendly set of policies, but which require kind of a different set of power brokers to help move things forward. I don't know if that answers some of your questions.
Other questions?
Thanks. Okay, probably. Okay. So how exceptional is this family rhetoric? Like, is it something that's been around in the U.S. labor movement for a long time? Is it something that's unique to immigrant rights / labor movements? Mm-hmm. And I guess, is it successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm not a labor historian, so I can't say. And I could attempt, but I'm sure there's a labor historian in the room who will correct me. To reframe your question, I think I would say, how exceptional is the family rhetoric to the labor movement? And does it also come out in some ways of the immigrant rights movement? And I think it's a question, empirical question, of whether or not the labor movement is parroting the narratives it sees from the immigrant rights movement, or is it kind of generating its own set of narrative strategies? And I think that there has been actually a lot written on kind of centering families as a mechanism of thinking about why immigrant rights matter. We heard some of this earlier. And the systematic problem with the family rhetoric, at least in the immigration context, is that because of the way the immigration policies are situated, the family rhetoric tends to reify a certain version of heteronormative family. And the faces of what aspects of family matter the very literal faces of those who've been included in sanctuary efforts, and the rest tend to be part and parcel of this kind of exceptional immigrant narrative. But I do think that it is a shift on the part of unions to think about the importance of policies that impact the families of members themselves. So if you take things like DACA, DACA was in some ways a non-starter for immigrants and for unions themselves. I mean, unions aren't for the most part, their members are not for the most part individuals who are going to benefit from some of these youth-oriented programs, despite their best efforts. That's not where the union rank and file is situated. But a move towards thinking about immigration policies that were not necessarily central to some of the kind of job creation policies that have often been a focus of some of the policy advocacy, and one that thought about immigrant family members as also being a direct obligation on the part of the unions to help. So the creation of funds to help individuals who are going through the DACA process, the kind of very, very concrete alliances that were created between United We Dream and the AFL-CIO happens through thinking about union members as being situated in mixed status families. And so I think that is unique, but I don't think that it's necessarily a big step away from how the immigrant rights movement has been framing the issue. But if there's labor historians here who can key us into how we think about the workers embedded in families, that would be helpful as well. That's a great point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm curious, so like my initial reaction to like seeing your approach or part of your methodological approach of interviewing labor leaders was I don't really care so much about labor leaders, or like my initial reaction was just like that seems like a more of a top-down model, like more of an advocacy model, which I'm nothing against being more inclusive, but like isn't the real power in like organizing the rank and file, and like if unions are being more inclusive to these workers, like is it just kind of self-interested, like getting recognizing that just doing the math and recognizing that the membership, or like to get member numbers they need to be more inclusive because the workforce is changing. And then I guess that's I had one more point, but yeah, just like the labor movement is like in decline anyway, so like don't we need like a different, shouldn't this be part of like a set of bigger, more structural changes of like increasing democracy among these workers, which obviously hard to do, but yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, but I do think that maybe it's helpful to just reiterate what the research question itself was, how is the leadership framing this, partly because they are the ones who have access to the halls of power around these policies. So that was explicitly my question, but you pose an excellent point, which is to say the perspectives of the labor leaders are necessarily probably going to differ from the rank and file, both in kind of positive and negative ways. And what follows from some of the, if what I'm arguing is there has to be deeper institutional change, should that start at the top, or does that have to come from the bottom? And I think it's an important corrective to some of the stuff that I just presented is also to say that some of the shifts that we see, as I presented, within the California unions, for example. If we look at California in the 90s, California was Arizona, right? And so some of those changes were not because some benevolent labor leader came along, it was because rank and file immigrant, largely women of color, people like Katie Kwan and others, kind of worked their way through the ranks to demand these changes at the top. So I think that it's an empirical quandary of, if you're interested in kind of the formal approach of any institution, who do you talk to get that, but what are you missing in the process of doing that? So I think it's a really good point. Yeah.
We have time for just one or two other brief questions. Shannon, I actually have a question. I'm just going to take the floor. So my question is, the labor movement is on the decline, right? So I guess I'm interested in just hearing you talk about your vision of the future of the labor movement, because you've talked so much about the labor movement, by which you're primarily talking about unions in this particular talk, but what is the future of the labor movement? And I guess the sub-question for that is, how do you get people who may be very mobilized in and caring about immigrant rights to care about the transformations in employment and the kind of decimation of worker rights in society more generally?
Yeah. Right, and so in some ways you're flipping the research on its head, which is to say, how do we think about the labor movement's approach to immigrant rights, but how has the immigrant rights movement also thought about the labor movement? And I'll give you an anecdote. I was sitting in a seminar with a very well-intentioned immigration law scholar who was talking about what are some of the solutions that we're going to have for the large population of young people who have DACA once they lose DACA or fall out of DACA. What are the solutions for them? And there was a lot of kind of concern on the part of our clinical faculty of creating resources to help them create entrepreneurial setups. And also from an educational context, people all across this campus and our campus are thinking creatively about how to create stipends for the work that they might be doing. In other words, moving away from a wage and hour model that sees these individuals as employees, thinking about kind of the gig economy as the solution for the the economic security of these workers. And the labor and employment law people threw up their hands and they're like, we're not okay with that. And so I think that's also a problem, right? And I think the problem is, how does the immigrant rights movement start to think about labor issues as being more than just job creation, and also thinking about not only the transactional relationship between kind of the unions that are going to show up for your rally and my rally, but also kind of long-lasting change. And yeah, I mean, I think part of this you'll see partly in terms of who votes, who within the immigrant rights movement, who are they going to endorse? Is it Bernie, or is it, something that looks more like Cory Booker, right? Just to betray some of my allegiance, right? But the policy questions are about economic reformation there. Labor movement on decline. Okay, so I come out of a labor school. We love unions, even though it's deeply in decline. But I think the two main questions that are on the table are, how do we think about the future of the labor movement? One, as the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, and the NLRB, which is an increasingly politicized body, become a non-starter for actually creating collective representation. So what do you do in that context with Janus and with the Supreme Court moving in the direction it is? The second part of this, and what does the collective bargaining agreement look like as a tool to build worker power? And an analogous part to this, which we talked a bit about in the seminar, which is what is the role of alt labor, worker centers, and then the rest? And should their goal be to look more like a labor union, or is it to radically transform a different basis of worker power? And it's an ongoing, I think, debate amongst legal scholars and worker advocates as to what makes more sense, right? And I think that's going to continue to be a point of contention. I think the courts are working out, to what extent should worker centers be treated like unions. Employers, I think, would like them to be treated like unions because they'd be subject to the same restrictions. But also unions are having to work out to what extent they're going to invest in groups that don't follow the same rules that they do, not just because it's a point of charity, but because it's a point of building worker power in a future that will look more like what those workers at, in the central, worker center, central New York looks like than what the Central Labor Council looks like. And I think we'll see in some ways a generational shift in terms of leadership. But it seems like a concession on the part of unions to move in that direction. But we do have examples of, Fight for 15 being a key positive story. But again, the goal was Fight for 15, not, UBI, and a union. Business unionism, let's pacify worker struggle. So, future of the labor movement. When I come here and I meet you guys, I'm optimistic. So, but I hope that answers your question.
Cool. Well, let's give Shannon a round of applause. Thank you.